This is brilliant geopolitics. This is what makes presidential administrations have legacies that extend well into a century. And if they stay on this trajectory as it relates to China and the CCP's access to natural resources, then we become very hopeful at Heritage that we don't have to worry about a war with the CCP.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. I'm Larry O'Connor, and we continue our focus this week on the threat of China and America's sovereignty. And we're going to focus this week on one of the most important pieces of that global strategic competition, and that is energy, mineral resources, oil, rare earth minerals. Yes, that's right. What seems to be boring stuff about rocks and things down under the planet's surface has actually become the stuff of some of the biggest fights on the global stage right now. And believe it or not, China is whooping our butt, but there's still a chance to be able to come back from that brink. Recently, the United States conducted a major military operation in Venezuela, as you know, and it has implications for control of oil and minerals that go well beyond just that country. Really, it's about the Western Hemisphere. And that strike in Venezuela had more to do about China than any other country on the planet. Let's bring in Dr. Kevin Roberts to educate us on all this stuff and do a deep dive into all these issues. Thank you, Kevin. Am I overstating the case? That really, I mean, yes, obviously Venezuela was about the narco trafficking and about, Maduro himself and the freedom of the Venezuelan people. But China felt it in Beijing probably more than any other country.
Yeah, you're totally right. And as I was listening to what really was, I'm not just being a polite friend, Larry, excellent summary of all the dots to be connected here. It occurred to me that we get the opportunity right now to live through one of the great shifts in geopolitics in modern history. Now, whether it's one of the great shifts in all of history, time will tell. But just as the conclusion of the Cold War, which you and I are old enough to have experienced, was one of those shifts, this is the most important sense. And it's because the United States, frankly, because of Donald Trump's leadership, has reprised its role as a superpower, which means it isn't just going to confront China in symmetrically in terms of warfare. It is going to do it in an even smarter way, which is, of course, revitalizing its leadership in its own hemisphere, evidenced by the Venezuela action.
It's nothing new that wars have been waged in world history over natural resources, whether it's access to waterways and shipping lanes or agricultural concerns or, yes, minerals like gold and silver and iron and all that jazz. And let's not forget oil, certainly. But now we've got these rare earth minerals, these things, lithium, cobalt, all these other things, and they seem to be 10 times more scarce and more valuable and more critical. Is this sort of the new playing field now when it comes to this sort of discussion about actual potential warfare over the stuff underground?
Well, it really is, and not just because these are vital to so many of our treasured consumer products. You know, the smaller the device, the more important the rare earths are to it, but also because of military technology. These minerals are the basis of certainly most of the new developments in military technology, and therefore, whichever country has access to the greatest number of them is going to be at an advantage in war, just as in World War II, the whole strategy of the Japanese and the Germans was who could control access to oil. And
Yeah.
the United States wisdom, coupled with great strategy and heroism of the Brits in particular, was not just to figure out where to go defeat them militarily, but to position our own Army and Navy and Air Force to block that access. That's really why ultimately our strategy in World War II prevailed.
I read a paper at the Heritage Foundation website. That's right. I read your papers.
That's
Everybody
good to
should.
know.
There was specifically one about these rare earths and how critical they have become to America's military and defense systems, our navigation systems, and things like that. And China dominates in this sector. How did that happen? Is it just that all these things happen to be in their territory, or have they been strategic about acquiring it on the globe?
Well, they've got a little bit of an advantage there in terms of their own territory, but they much more important than that is that with the geopolitical savvy that has been an attribute of China's, especially under Xi's leadership, they have very intentionally, very methodically found all of those other places, all of those other places in the world with stores of rare earth minerals and developed economic political partnerships, although a lot of these heads of state in these places have said it's more like dealing with a mafia boss, with one exception, and that's the United States, which
Yeah.
itself, has a little bit of an advantage there, but nothing like what exists in some other parts of the world.
So our friends on the left, you know those guys over there, whenever they tell us about carbon emissions and global warming or climate change or whatever euphemism they're using now, the solution has always been to wean ourselves off of what they call fossil fuels, oil and gas, and get onto electric vehicles and just everything electric, right? Because we want no more wars for oil. We don't want any wars for oil. Instead of having a war for oil, we're just going to move to electric cars. But Dr. Roberts, they forgot one thing. Those electric cars, they require all these rare earth minerals. So, I mean, now what are we supposed to do? It seems like they've boxed us into a corner and there's going to be new wars, just not for oil. It's going to be for this other stuff.
It's like we've taken one really terrible decision and compounded it with two additional terrible decisions. One of them is you just go back a few years to the first Trump term. You'll remember those aforementioned leftist friends saying that the Earth was going to end because the Trump administration was opposed to the Paris Climate Accords. And then when you got into the details of it, everyone in the world had to abide by these really strict clean air and clean water standards. And let's just say that, those were common sense and normal. They weren't, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say they were. Which country was provided an exception to those? China
Let me
was.
guess. China, of
China
course,
was.
China.
And
Well,
then,
they're a
and then,
developing nation, Dr.
yes, that's
Roberts.
right. It's a human rights issue. And then the second terrible decision to compound on top of that original one is that as we were shutting down at about the same time, we're shutting down American coal plants. Who's ramping up coal plants to expand their economy? The Chinese. So it's as if the leaders of the West, they used to get together in Europe, once every 5 or 10 years and decide this is how geopolitics will operate for the next generation or century. It's as if they got together and said, let's carve things up and make some really dumb decisions so that the Chinese can be the world's hegemon. That's
Yeah.
basically what it seems like.
And meanwhile, it's even stupider when you think about the fact that we, through God's blessings, are sitting on a whole lot of coal and a whole lot of oil right here in our country. But no, we're not going to touch that. We'll power everything with a windmill. All right. Our libertarian friends, you know them, they're going to tell us, listen, the market will figure all of this out. Sure, China has some access and maybe even a monopoly on all these rare earth minerals. But, if the price is right, this is what's going to keep us going. Global trade, just let the market figure it out. Is that naive?
It is naive on one major level, and that is that we have been in a war footing with China for much longer than most Americans realize. And so this is in academic circles, what we call the national security exception to these libertarian dogmas, which I'm always happy to challenge. Now, at the basis of that is something fair that in a steady state environment, an environment of peace, let's let the market, for all intents and purposes, do its thing. But in this case, and especially with rare earth minerals, it is the most egregious example of how our complacency and a little bit of relying on that dogma has led us to this problem. And so I would just encourage our libertarian friends or people who think that the market is always, always going to solve things to realize that even if you might be right in many or most circumstances with that argument, that in this case you're not, and you really have to suspend that for the sake of national security.
All right, we've already dabbled into our historical nuggets, but let's go even further because we love to geek out on your history. 18th century, we're looking at coal and steel dominance on a global scale. 20th century was all about oil, of course. Now that we've ventured into this new world of these resources and these rare earth minerals, what can we learn from the past about how to deal with China on this issue?
Well, we've got to lock down our own access, American access to those sources. And we have begun doing that, thankfully, under the first Trump term and expanded now. The second thing is we have to be more proactive in beginning to dislodge the Chinese access to those sources. This is why, at least in the case of oil, particularly the heavy crude that is kind of the specialty of Venezuela and that China relies on, we have dislodged the Chinese for all intents and purposes from that source. And the third area that has concerned us at Heritage is the continent of Africa, largely ignored by too many American policymakers on the left and the right when it comes to the ability of the Chinese to establish beachheads, not just for sort of political patronage at the level of heads of state, but because of the access to some of these rare earth minerals. So the good news is the lessons of history seem to be known by the current administration and they seem to be being implemented. We just need many successive years of implementing those lessons to make sure that we can weaken the Chinese by limiting their access to those minerals.
I've never quite understood something. China, it's well documented. They'll go into these African nations and they'll build them new roads and new highways, and they'll pay for it. And they'll build them a soccer stadium. They call it football over there, and they pay for that too. And in the Caribbean, I saw they built a huge cricket stadium because they love cricket down there, in exchange for a big presence down there in the Caribbean. And so they do all of this. They get into those countries, and then they get these sweetheart deals to basically rape the land of all of these minerals, strip mining them. And how come when China does it, Dr. Roberts, it's not evil colonialism? If we tried to do stuff like that, and it would make sense, and we'd do it in a lot nicer and friendlier and happier way, we'd be called the evil colonialists.
Yeah, there's no greater hypocrisy than the double hypocrisy of what European leaders and some leftists in the United States allow the Chinese to get away with. On the one hypocrisy is it is colonialism. I mean, if this isn't mercantilism, what is? But
Yeah.
and supposedly we exist in the early 21st century to eliminate all vestiges of colonialism, such that I was in Oxford and Cambridge in the UK in the end of 2025 talking to some of the students. I said, how are your history classes? They said, well, they're great, except we're now just entirely skipping over the colonial history of the British Empire, good and bad and in between. But the second hypocrisy is in this religion of net zero, or as we refer to in the United States, the Green New Deal, the Chinese are the biggest sinners, and they're favored with all of these policies. The good news
Yeah.
is the president connected all of these dots, I think, very eloquently at his recent speech at Davos, and it is a real masterclass in laying bare these hypocritical policy positions, especially by the European Union, but let's be honest, also by some American policymakers.
It's a bit of a tangent, but it's okay that you lead me
We
down
do
paths
that.
sometimes. I do the same to you, but it is remarkable in retrospect. World Economic Forum, just for people watching this episode, just happened for us in real time a little over a week ago. China was an afterthought in Davos, wasn't it? Didn't you notice that the dominance of President Trump in that setting? And I mean, China's looms, I know that, but they do seem to be somewhat marginalized right now because of the American policies.
It's true. It's, what we heard at Heritage during the Biden years, among the obvious things, and it was, from heads of state, from government officials, ambassadors from countries around the world, but especially from Africans up and down the continent, was there is a vacuum of leadership on our continent. And I, largely knew what they were talking about, but I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, the Chinese are present with their Belt and Road Initiative. And thankfully, our governments are beginning to learn that that is just a fool's errand because, the Chinese provide all of this favorable financing, but the infrastructure they're building is awful because really what they're doing is just trying to establish a foothold. This is a sort of modern colonial project. But the vacuum was the United States, literally in some cases, wasn't even present. And so, if you think about all the achievements that the administration has made in international policy, the Trump administration, Larry, they've been active everywhere. They've also been more active in Africa, such that when you get to the World Economic Forum, those European leaders know that. And
Huh.
China can be made an afterthought if the United States steps into that vacuum of power.
All right. Back on topic, though. Let's
Oh,
weave
come
back from this
on.
tangent, although not completely off, because one mention of China that I heard over and over again in Davos had to do with European leaders agreeing, although you hadn't heard it from them for many years, that China can't get its hands on Greenland. Greenland was a big part of the conversation, and a lot of that had to do with these very same rare earth minerals. What can we learn here about what the Trump administration was able to sort of jujitsu there with regard to our access to those rare earth minerals in Greenland, and why everybody agrees that this also had much to do with China and their ability to try to get in on this hemisphere?
Well, two things. First, that the Trump administration, Energy Secretary Wright, Rubio, the whole lot, but especially those guys, knew that it wouldn't be sufficient just for the United States to deregulate the obstacles to American production for rare earth minerals. There simply aren't enough. I first encountered the importance of rare earth minerals when I was living in Wyoming and visited a place that I think is now under production in northeastern Wyoming. But all that to say, there aren't many. So you can't catch up with the Chinese access to rare earths if all you're doing is focused on domestic production, as important as that is. And so it led the administration to a second really important point. It had already exhibited this in Venezuela. It had already exhibited this in other parts of the world, but now it's going to exhibit it in another part of our hemisphere, and that would be Greenland, by overstating what we would be willing to do, the methods we would take in order to come to acquire Greenland, which caused this huge distraction by the American press, by European leaders, and some people who purport to be conservatives in the United States. When most of us realize, especially my colleagues at Heritage, because they're the best in the business, Trump's just trying to get access to the place so that the Chinese don't. And look at that. I mean, there are details of this deal that need to be finalized, but everyone is reporting it's in the right zone. And the Chinese are mum because they realize they have been outflanked by the Trump administration again. This is precisely what the administration needs to be doing, and it's not a moment
Yeah.
too soon.
Well, and the fact that it comes just a couple of weeks after that strike in Venezuela that I'd love to get back to now, because yes, it had to do with Maduro being a narco terrorist, him seizing power after an obvious fraudulent election, all those things, obviously. But it also had to do with oil. It definitely had to do with oil drills and oil fields that we paid for, that our American companies built there before they were seized by Chavez and the Marxists. So, talk about, again, what we can learn from what the Trump administration is doing here, willing to use military might for the sake of these minerals, these resources that are so critical on a global stage, and China, how China gets affected by it.
Well, before getting into comment about the minerals themselves, let me offer a compliment to the administration for precision military action that was not an inordinate number of boots on the ground as they were. It wasn't as it doesn't seem a few weeks later to be a protracted conflict. We at Heritage certainly have been, along with many conservatives, saying, let's be sure we get in and out and make sure we don't get back into this interventionism, which Trump certainly has no stomach for. So I just applaud the administration for now a second time thinking about the Iran strike, which is very similar, pulling that off in ways that are comfortable for the entire electorate. But the second thing about the minerals, and this is a little underappreciated by people, and we're rightly focused on Venezuela and what that means for them and for the hemisphere, and that would be enough. The real long-term consequences of this, in addition to that, for the world, are that we have dislodged, for all intents and purposes, Chinese access to not just oil generally, but a particular version, heavy crude, that they rely
Mhm.
on for their developing industry. That's doubly beneficial for the United States. You dislodge the Chinese access, and our refineries on our own Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Texas, which is to say the best ones in the world, have relatively close access to that heavy crude, and it will be a boon for their own business. This is just, Larry, I mean, I'm a fan of the administration. I'm sometimes a critic of things that I think they could do more of, but I'm a fan accounting for that. And I just mean this from a policy point of view, a little bit of a history one. This is brilliant geopolitics. This is what makes presidential administrations have legacies that extend well into a century. And if they stay on this trajectory as it relates to China and the CCP's access to natural resources, then we become very hopeful at Heritage that we don't have to worry about a war with the CCP.
Well, listen, when you lay it out there that way, it does seem like a triple bank shot in terms of everything that was achieved there for America's interests. America first, if that matters to you, that's definitely a great operation. But then add to that, let's not get it lost in the mix, that while our friends in Beijing are watching that operation, they can see what we're capable of with our military. If we want something, we're able to execute a strike like that with such precision and without a single casualty and without leaving one piece of damaged equipment behind. They can't do that. So it sends a pretty strong message there in terms of the global standoff we've got with our military interests right now.
No, it really does. And one thing that hasn't come up in this conversation is Taiwan. And
Yeah.
obviously this is what most people think is going to be the proximate cause for a more open conflict between the United States and China. We at Heritage think that that might be true or it might not be true. And if it ends up not being true, then it's going to be because of actions like what the administration took in Venezuela and also the approach that they've taken to Greenland.
All right, we're shooting everything through America's 250 here this year because we love our country so much. So, how does this relate? Well, let's go back to one of our founders, a gentleman named Monroe. He had a doctrine. It had to do with the best interests of this country and being able to seize resources that would help us thrive and help our prosperity and our national security. So tell me how all of this conversation with regard to natural resources, mineral oil, how does that relate to what they're now calling Monroe 2.0 or the Donroe Doctrine?
Well, I'll meet you and I'll raise you one. So on the Monroe Doctrine, this is a beautiful revitalization of a policy that most American presidents, Republican and Democrat, have honored, which is once you get to the late 1800s, and obviously the Monroe Doctrine had been established well before them, but once you get to the late 1800s and the United States is recognized around the world as a superpower, it starts getting pulled all over the globe. We have experienced that in particular in our lifetimes. And the beauty of the Monroe Doctrine now, having gone through that additional experience of over interventionism, is that it reminds us that if we see American foreign policy, American geopolitics, first through the lens of the everyday American, but then secondly through the lens of how we maintain our hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Latin America, then we're going to get all the other priorities right. This is brilliance on a historical level because it also helps us prioritize resources as we're going through ways that we can somehow at least modestly expand the budget of the Department of War while not overspending on priorities that don't matter. But the raise you one part, I will say, is related directly to Venezuela. Because prior to Monroe, Thomas Jefferson, whom Monroe served as secretary, well, served as cabinet, Thomas Jefferson was the one who took war to the Tripoli pirates because they were
That's right.
interfering with American shipping. Jefferson, in today's parlance and foreign policy, he would be the restrainer. He
Yes.
understood that you had to project American power overseas. And so these two things go hand in hand in ways that the smartest policymakers in the administration and on Capitol Hill, like Senator Mike Lee, understand. This is my encouragement to the audience, Larry. I get excited about this because there are always lessons from history. And I get real excited as a historian who now has some role in leading policy when the history is understood so well and applied so consistently with its original meaning. The president deserves a lot more credit than he's gotten for this because I think this is a resetting of how America should do geopolitics.
So, can America remain free if all of our technologies and our future technologies that we don't even know about and our very defense system rely on resources that are at the moment sort of dominated or controlled by a foreign country?
There's no way. And our research at Heritage over the last few years shows that we have about a decade, if that, to reverse course. Hopefully, the actions we've talked about in this episode have accelerated the progress we've made toward being on a level footing with the Chinese for now, but ultimately surpassing them again.
Yeah, and what's frustrating from my perspective here is just a regular old Joe in America is that if this is so critical and so important, why haven't these conversations been taking place in the public square up until now? I mean, I didn't really hear about any of these issues really until this administration.
I think three things. Number one, all of us, myself included, were slow in recognizing how many advancements the Chinese had made. And that's because we were going about our lives and we really thought the Chinese were more backwards than they were. And under Xi in particular, the CCP has been it's successful, frankly, across the board, unfortunately. But the second is Washington policymakers are kind of lagging indicators as well, and they take some time for convincing. The third is the harshest factor, and that is that our American policymakers are influenced by Chinese lobbying.
Yeah.
And in the same way that, as we've talked about with TikTok, we've talked about with Chinese university students, there are insidious sources of influence in the nation's capital as it relates to confronting these problems. And so for us at Heritage, we realized a year ago, it isn't enough just for us to analyze these problems and propose some solutions and go advocate for the solutions. We also have to get to the origins of one of the problems. And we're doing that with an effort at exposing some of the lobbying that the CCP pays for in our own Congress.
Well, Dr. Roberts, I think we've proved a lot of things this week. First and foremost, geology can be really cool. But
Who
also
knew?
energy and access to minerals is not just about the economy and about the Green New Deal and about electric cars and all of that jazz. It's about national strategies. It's about national sovereignty. These minerals are the fuel for prosperity, for defense, and ultimately for independence. And as we look for another 250 years in this country, the competition over resources is among the most consequential in our history. And we're living at the dawn of the most important fight right now. Next week, we continue our focus on China, and this time, the very critically important issue China and America's pharmaceutical supply chain. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll see you then. This is The Kevin Roberts Show.